Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Stephen Kotkin, and I'm the acting director of the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, while Mark Beisinger is on sabbatical. So I have the honor to inaugurate this year's Director's Book Forum, which showcases books by Princeton faculty. Today it's a double honor because we have two speakers, Eduardo Cadava, professor of English, and also master, literally and figuratively, of the Princeton undergraduate experience. I say that without exaggeration. And Graciela Nouzeilles, who is the chair, as you know, of Spanish and Portuguese. So it's a double honor today to have two Princeton faculty, and in fact, it's a double honor squared because their exhibit is on display right now, as most of you know, through January 19th, right down the hall. And so I would advise everyone who hasn't seen it yet, right after the talk, to go immediately there, but walk, do not run, as they say. Because we don't want anybody to get hurt, but it's a very impressive exhibit. And I understand we'll get a very nice prescient overview. The Itinerant Language of Photography, they say that nothing lies like a photograph. But then again, what's the definition of lie? Right? In it, I'm sorry. I'm just practicing this acting director role. And I'm trying it out a little bit. This is the inaugural event, so I'm still feeling it. I think I'll need a little bit of indulgence as we go forward, but fortunately Mark will be back in September, so it won't be a long experiment. In any case, without further ado, please, Eduardo Cadava and Graciela Nouzeilles.
Thank you for being here. We divided the presentation into two. And I would like to give you the background of the project that ends with the exhibition and the catalog that accompanies the exhibition. And I would like to start with a quotation that to some extent encapsulates some of the conceptual questions that run through the whole project. The image passes us by. We have to follow its movement as far as possible, but we must also accept that we can never entirely possess it. And this is a quotation from George D.D. Uberman, Contact Images. The Itinerant Languages of Photography begins with the conviction that photography, as a set of technologies and practices, a series of discourses and languages, an ever-expanded archive, resists being fixed in a single space and time. I'm sorry, I forgot. It seeks to trace the movement of photographs as physical artifacts, as means of communication, as disembodied images, and indeed to begin to develop a visual and linguistic lexicon for understanding and speaking about their migratory character. Like postcards, which often bear photographs and therefore evoke the itinerancy of images in general, photographs are moving signs that, traveling from one context to another, carry any number of open secrets. These secrets are traveling from one context to another, these secrets are simultaneously exposed and veiled, postmarked and yelled, full of dormant, unexpected meanings, waiting to be viewed and read in the future. They travel from one forum to another, from the intimacy of the family album to the semi-privacy of museums and galleries, from print media into electronic, digitalized states, and with each reconceptualization and rereading, they redefine themselves and take on different and expanding significances. From this perspective, we could say that the history of photography is the history of a Pandora's box, which opened at its beginnings, still lies in wait to have its inexhaustible worlds opened and circulated even further. The Itinerant Languages of Photography began in the fall of 2010 as an experimental 3-year interdisciplinary project sponsored by the Princeton Council for International Teaching and Research that sought to develop a photography research network in collaboration with several universities, the Tela University from Buenos Aires, the Universidade Federal de Rio de Janeiro, and the Center for Photographic Research at the Instituto Moreira Salles in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, the Centro de Historia Gráfica at the Universidad de Puebla, México, and the University Pompeu Fabra from Barcelona. Our aim was to initiate and develop new forms of international interdisciplinary collaboration across widely varied fields of expertise that could bring together scholars, curators, photographers, and artists from Latin America, Spain, and the United States, and potentially other areas of the world, all of whom are involved in international circuits of image production. In collaboration with our partners, we organized a series of international and interdisciplinary conferences, colloquia, and workshops in Princeton, Barcelona, Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City, involving not only scholars and cultural critics, but also curators, writers, photographers, and artists from different countries. Viewing photography as a transnational cultural practice, as a complex, multi-layered field of technological, aesthetic, social, and critical traditions, we encourage the participants to think about different forms of photographic circulation and itinerancy. The meetings include the presentation by many scholars and artists, including Susan Meiselas, Atelier Retaguardia, Joan Fontcuberta, Mario Velatin, Alfredo Jard, Pedro Meyer, Pablo Ortiz Monasterio, Christopher Finney, Rosângela Rennó, Marcelo Brodsky, Graciela Esperanza, and many others. The project sought to study what we call the itinerant languages of photography, and in particular, how these languages operate within the history of photography in general and within international and global networks of collaboration and exchange. The phrase itinerant languages refers to the various means whereby photographs not only speak, but also move across historical periods, national borders, and different mediums. Our exploration has taken as its point of departure Latin American and Spanish-Catalonian archives, even as it has also sought to demonstrate that these archives cannot be contained within national or regional narratives. In the context of an explosion of world photography, Latin America has been at the forefront of the development of new aesthetic paradigms in modern and contemporary photography. The region also possesses some of the world's most outstanding photographic archives, including the Instituto Moreira Salles collection in Rio with more than 550,000 photographs, the Fototeca Nacional in Pachuca, Mexico, which holds more than 800,000 images, and the Hermanos Mayo archive housed in Mexico's General National Archive with more than 5 million images and photographic artifacts. Equally significant to us is the diversity that characterizes Latin American photography, and it has been deeply affected by the continent's regional histories and its vast cultural and ethnic heterogeneity. Across the Atlantic, and marked by the complexities of a country with many conflicted cultural and political traditions, Barcelona gave us access to a rich Catalonian tradition of modern photographers with a long history of exchanges with Latin America and Europe. These different sites help us call attention to significant but often neglected histories of photography beyond the dominant European and American canon, and in particular to the transnational dimension of image production at a time when photography is at the center of debates on the role of representation, authorship, and communication in global contemporary art and culture. In particular, we were interested in considering three perspectives on itinerancy, and I'm going to explain them very quickly. First, the circulation and exchange of images beyond cultural, social, ethnic, and national borders. Whatever form photography has taken, it has been destined to travel, to move across the globe and in innumerable guises. If we have wanted to think about itinerant photography in relation to particular national archives, Brazilian archive, Spanish archive, Argentinian archive, we also have been interested in how these origins and archives are produced, affected, and transformed by the circulation, appropriation, and reinterpretation of images by different political and cultural agents. From the beginning, the movement of photographs was facilitated by traveling photographers with different agendas, and it has been intensified even further by ever-changing technological means. For this reason, we also wanted to think about images that were produced in order to be circulated, beginning with the invention of postcards in the context of national and international tourism, continuing all the way to the radical transformations in image production and exchange that have emerged in the aftermath of new electronic and technological developments such as the internet, among many others. Two, we were also interested in the dialogue between photography and other mediums, such as literature, cinema, architecture, and art. Since 1839, when the invention of the daguerreotype was made public, photography has established itself in dialogue with other mediums, borrowing, adapting, and incorporating traits of these mediums, but also questioning the logic of representation that it presumably shared with them. In light of contemporary debates on intermedia, or what is some critics have called the post-medium era, the project poses the question of the itinerant language of photography as it approaches, engages, and intersects with different mediums that in turn transform our sense of photography itself. Three, finally, we wanted to think about the relationship between photography and the archive. We believe that the paradoxical condition of the archive, the hesitation between inscription and itinerancy, is intrinsic to photography itself. Photography is both Medusian and Protean. It does congeal what it sees, but it also sets itself, and with it is reference, into motion. It both mummifies and sets free. Unlike its predecessor, the camera oscura, the photograph separates the viewer in time and space from the objects or subjects that generated the image. As a secondary image, with the potential for endless duplication, the photograph has the capacity to bring to a multitude of potential viewers the traces of the past or a glimpse of what is not available to all, triggering endless and unexpected uses and interpretations. Photographic images are essentially mutable and fluid artifacts, at once at home in any context, while simultaneously in transit. Loose leaves without predetermined destination push forward or around through perceptual and affective exchanges. The Itinerant Languages of Photography completes its cycle with a photographic exhibition, which we have envisioned as at once a multi-layered material installation and a conceptual apparatus through which we can further explore photography's itinerant condition. Enacting an instance of this essential itinerancy by transporting photographs across oceans and continents to the Princeton University Art Museum, the exhibition represents a collaboration between the museum and the Fundación Fotocolectània in Barcelona, the National Library of Brazil, and the Instituto Moreira Salles in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, the Fototeca Nacional of Mexico in Mexico City, and modern and contemporary photographers across different national borders. The exhibition is divided into 4 sections. The titles are Itinerant Photographs, Itinerant Revolutions, Itinerant Subjects, and Itinerant Archives, each seeking to illustrate an aspect of the movement of photographs in relation to particular archives, national archives mostly. Even as, because of the movable borders between the sections, each section serves as a kind of caption for the others. Beyond this explicit narrative organization, and I think probably you have noticed this in the slideshow, beyond this explicit narrative organization, there is a second order of understanding at the work, according to which Spanish, Argentine, Brazilian, and Mexican photographic images converse across temporal, political, and cultural boundaries, speaking a language of graphic figures, historical citations, and visual echoes that seeks to replicate photography's itinerancy in the experience of the viewer who moves from room to room and from page to page in the case of the catalog. The book, The Itinerant Languages of Photography, corresponds to but also transcends the display of photographic works at the Princeton Art Museum. In its approach to the narrative sequencing of the images and their presentation on the page, it seeks to inscribe the potential of a new series of iterations, as the photographic contents of the exhibition continue their journey within its pages. Like Duchamp's Restless Suitcase, the book format provides a means of transportation and the open promise of future readings and interpretations. It also offers the possibility of productive connections between word and image through the inclusion of essays about photographic itinerancy, 2 general essays written by Eduardo and I, and 4 by scholars and writers from the sites represented in the project. Joan Fontcuberta from Barcelona, Valeria González from Buenos Aires, Mauricio Lisowski from Rio de Janeiro, and John Brass from Mexico City, and 1 by a guest scholar from the United States, Thomas Keenan. Each contributor was invited to explore one or more aspects of photography's itinerant condition in relation to particular photographers or photographs without the requirement that their materials had to be represented in the exhibition. To conclude, whether as a project, symposia, exhibition, or catalog, the Itinerant Language of Photography seeks to explore, embody, and enact photography's essential itinerancy, which defines a medium that has no other fixity than its own incessant transformation, its endless movement across space and time. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to thank all of you for being here as well, and I'd like to thank PIIRS for inviting us to speak to you about our project, and also to everyone who helped make the book an object. Some of them are in this room, so thank you very much. I want to leave time for discussion, so I thought what I would do is begin with a citation, and then after reading a brief excerpt from the book, I will then turn to a project that we included in the exhibition and also in the book, and that has in many ways guided us in terms of what we wanted to do within the book and in the project. So the citation is from a 1999 essay by Michel Foucault on photogenic painting. And he writes, "The years 1860 to 1880 witnessed a new frenzy for images, which circulated rapidly between camera and easel, between canvas and plate and paper, sensitized or printed. With all the new powers acquired, there came a new freedom of transposition, displacement and transformation, of resemblance and dissimulation, of reproduction, duplication, and trickery of effect. There emerged a vast field of play where technicians and amateurs, artists and illusionists, unworried about identity, took pleasure in disporting themselves. Perhaps they were less in love with paintings or photographic plates than with the images themselves, with their migration and perversion, their transvestism, their disguised their disguised difference. Images, whether drawings, engravings, photographs, or paintings, were no doubt admired for their power to make one think of other things. But what was particularly enchanting was their ability, in their surreptitious difference, to be mistaken for one another. The emergence of realism cannot be separated from this great surge and flurry of multiple and similar images. Fidelity to things themselves was both a challenge to and the occasion for this glide of the images that danced and turned about them, always the same and imperceptibly different. How might we recover this madness, this insolent freedom that accompanied the birth of photography? In those days, images traveled the world under false identities. To them, there was nothing more hateful than to remain captive, self-identical, in one painting, one photograph, one engraving, under the aegis of one author. No medium, no language, no syntax could contain them. From birth to last resting place, they could always escape through new techniques of transposition." End quote. So what Foucault tells us is that photography has never been a single thing. Its signature characteristic is perhaps its capacity to take on different forms relentlessly and restlessly, to migrate, to travel, to move, often away from itself, and often in relation to other mediums. Indeed, within this frenzy of circulation, this irresistible movement of transposition, displacement, transformation, and reproduction, how can we even say what a photograph is? Especially when, as he would have it, the birth of photography did not announce the birth of a discrete medium, but rather an unprecedented explosion of incessantly changing visual phenomena, of all sorts of hybrid interactions among several mediums, including drawing, painting, engravings, and photography. Within this incessant movement and transformation, how can we specify what a photograph is? What is it that makes a photograph as opposed to something else? How can we know what a photograph is when it has appeared in so many different guises? Heliograph, photogenic drawing, calotype, talbotype, cyanotype, daguerreotype, photogram, pinhole, analog, or digital photograph. But also in relation to so many different processes, among others, silver chloride, collodion, gelatin emulsion, pinhole, celluloid film base, and digitization. In reviewing the history of photography, the only thing we can say with certainty is that a photograph has never been a consistent thing, has never remained identical to itself. Instead, it continually has been altered, transformed, circulated, and by definition, itinerant. This itinerancy can be seen even in the history of what we have come to regard as the very first photograph, Niepce's View from the Window at Le Gras. In 1826, seeking to develop different techniques that might help him improve the process of making lithographs, Niepce set up a camera obscura in the bedroom window of his country house. He placed a polished pewter plate coated with bitumen in it and opened the lens. Accounts of the length of the experiment differ, but because the exposure time seems to have been anywhere from 8 hours to 3 or more days, what is clear is that the duration made it impossible for the photographed buildings and landscape to correspond to the human gaze. Niepce removed the plate, and washing it, he enabled the image of the view from the window to appear, however faintly. The result was a permanent, direct, positive picture whose gradations of light were produced by the alternations between the hardened bitumen and the surface of the pewter plate. Immediately after its production, even as Niepce moved and carried it around his household, this first heliograph began its itinerant life. The 19th century would see it pass from Niepce through a variety of hands, beginning with a trip to London in 1827 via Paris, where he met Daguerre. Niepce also tried to attract attention to his experiment with the Royal Society, but without success. He ended up leaving several examples of his work to the painter Francis Bauer, including the view from the window at Le Gras, framed like a presentation piece, like a kind of painting. After Bauer's death in 1841, the image passes through various hands until it is exhibited at the retrospective Crystal Palace Photographic Exhibition in London in 1898. It then slips into obscurity for over 50 years. In 1952, the art historian Helmut Gernsheim was able to follow the traces, establish the work's provenance, and discover where family members of the plate's last recorded owner had forgotten that it was stored. Securing the photograph, but concluding that he would hand the picture over to a research library, Gernsheim decided that he would make a drawing of the scene in the original size first, and he did so in February 1952. He then contacted first Scotland Yard and then the Kodak Research Laboratory to see if, because of their expertise in different modes of decipherment and reproduction, he could get the photograph reproduced. It was first photographed by the Kodak Research Laboratory in March, but because Gernsheim was disappointed at this print, he claimed that the reproduction in no way corresponded with the original. He spent nearly 2 days trying to eliminate with watercolor the hundreds of light spots and blotches. Although his efforts resulted in a more uniform and clearly defined image, his reproduction only approximated the original. As he explains, its pointillistic effect is completely alien to the medium, for the silver-gray surface of the Niepce photograph is as smooth as a mirror, end quote. The photograph is now in the Harry Ransom collection at the University of Texas and must be viewed under controlled lighting in order for its image to be visible. However non-itinerant it now seems to be in its final resting place, it continues to circulate in all of its reproductions and to escape, in Foucault's words, through new techniques of transposition. The history of this photograph not only suggests the wild itinerancy of the image we know as the first photograph, the literal itinerancy of an image that travels geographically and from hand to hand, its itinerancy across different modes of reproduction, heliograph, drawing, photograph, watercolor, and so forth, and its movement across the innumerable contexts in which it has been reproduced in books and articles thousands of times. It also suggests that the photograph we know as the first photograph is not a photograph, or rather is not simply a photograph, since beyond its being framed like a painting, it is an archive of an entire network of relations and traces, of several different practices and processes, many of which were related to other mediums, including engraving, lithography, and painting. The fact of the photograph's itinerancy, the itinerancy of this particular photograph, but also the itinerancy of all photographs, is displayed and intensified in Joan Fontcuberta's 2005 Googlegram Niepce, 2005, which is based on Niepce's heliograph, and which is the photograph with which the Itinerant Languages of Photography exhibition begins, and with which the plate section of the book begins. The photograph was created by processing the results of a Google image search, in which the prompting keywords were simply photo and photo. Through photomosaic software, Fontcuberta gathered 10,000 images and recreated Niepce's photograph as a composite of these images. From a distance, we recognize Niepce's photograph, but as we get closer to the print's surface, we can see that this original is composed of a multiplicity of images of an unforeseeably mediated set of pictures and relations. The photomosaic constitutes an imagistic palimpsest that incorporates and recontextualizes earlier traces, and in so doing suggests that images can never remain self-identical to themselves, precisely because the memories and traces they bear are always multiple. Identifying the earlier Niepce image with a mesh of many different images, it also suggests that every image, including Niepce's, is itself a kind of archive. If the Googlegram's target image is a visual citation of Niepce's original photograph, its pixelated surface and composition call attention to the process that created it, a process that depends on the itinerancy of images without which the image could not have been composed. The images had to be gathered and transferred from the internet, in which they already had been reproduced, displaced, uploaded, and moved, in order to form Fontcuberta's print. A meditation on the circulation and itinerancy of images, Fontcuberta's image, produced as it is by a database of information that is constantly in flux, is a living, ever-changing testament to the dynamism of images. It references the possibilities of transformation inscribed within every photograph, from the very first photograph to the unprecedented number of photographs produced today and by innumerable technologies. According to a recent estimate, 375 billion digital photographs were taken in 2011. More than 3,000 images are uploaded in the Flickr photo sharing website every minute, and more than 300 million photos are uploaded on Facebook each day. A visual explosion that has emerged largely because of the proliferation of camera-ready mobile phones. The image evokes a series of questions at the heart of the relations and differences between analog and digital photography. What is the status of the referent in general, and especially in relation to these two modes of photography? In what way does the itinerancy of the image, an itinerancy that includes every image's movement away from itself and toward other images, unsettle the relation between the photograph and the photographed? If these questions already are legible in the first photograph, and if they are intensified in Fontcuberta's image, they are explored further in Rosângela Rennó's 2006 A Última Foto, The Last Photograph. For the project, Rennó gave a different mechanical camera to 43 Rio de Janeiro photographers. She instructed the photographers they could photograph anything in Rio as long as the photograph included the statue of Christ, the Redeemer of Corcovado, in it. After the photograph was taken, each camera was sealed and then framed alongside the photograph it took, inside a box and arranged as a diptych. Presented as specimens in a museum, the camera and its photograph would seem to bear witness to the passing of a medium. They present a photograph that, with the arrival of the digital era, is increasingly difficult to take. That there are 43 diptychs in the series implies that the series could continue indefinitely, however, which implies that none of these photographs are ever the last photo. This is confirmed in the diptych that is included in the book and that is its cover image. Produced with a Holga 120S, the image taken by Eduardo Brandão shows a hand moving into the frame from the right edge of the image and holding a digital camera that is taking a picture of the redeemed Christ statue. This is a remarkable image, and not only because in a series that references the obsolescence of analog photography, it seems to reverse the narrative that holds the works together by having an analog camera take an image of a digital camera, as if the digital existed before the analog, as if what the digital had introduced into the history of photography is already comprehended by earlier practices of photography, is already accounted for by the lens of an analog camera. Even within a series that presents itself as a lament for the passing of film photography, this work suggests that digitization is still survived by earlier modes of reproduction. If neither the so-called death of photography nor the supposed transformations of photography have resulted in its death, it is because the history of photography has never been a single linear history, and also because, as Jeffrey Batchen has noted, photography itself has never been a single technology. Its very history has been defined by numerous competing instances of technological innovation and obsolescence, and this without any threat to its survival. Indeed, it is because a change in imaging technology can never alone cause the disappearance of the photograph that contemporary debates over the relation between photography and the new reproductive technologies must remain as concerned with photography's past and present as they are about its future. What is at stake is thinking exactly what photography is today, even after all its obituaries have been written. The Itinerant Languages of Photography has this task as one of its central aims. And I want to close then by just describing one more set of images that were very important to us and that raised a number of questions for us throughout the project. It's a project that's entitled Visual Correspondences. It's a project that was initiated by the Argentine photographer Marcelo Brodsky. And the project included Marcelo Brodsky, the Catalan photographer Manuel, the Brazilian photographer Cássio Vasconcelos, Mexican photographer Pablo Ortiz Monasterio, the English photographer Martin Parr, and the German artist Horst Hoheisel. And what Marcelo did is he would send a photograph to the photographers and artists. The photographers would reply with a photograph and the artist with a drawing, and then he would reply to that photograph or drawing again with a photograph, and he would continue like this, and they'd get 40, 50 images, and that would constitute a correspondence. One of the things that there are a lot of things that I think that are interesting about the project. It raises lots of questions about agency, about communication, correspondence, the relationship between the visual and the linguistic, and the itinerancy of images in general. And one of the things that we were thinking about, and I can just give you this one example, we were asking questions such as these, like what happens when Marcelo Brodsky goes to Spain in the early 80s during the dictatorship. He goes to Barcelona in exile and begins to study photography with the Catalonian photographer Manuel. Can you begin to think about the alteration that takes place in the practices of these two photographers after that encounter? And once they start taking photographs after the encounter, can you locate the photographs that they take within a national tradition? So one of the things that we were thinking about is whether or not once Marcelo goes to Spain and studies with Esclusa and starts taking photographs, if you can say that those photographs are Argentine photographs, right? Or if his eyes remain Argentine, or if they then become some cross between Argentine, Catalan, and of course with Esclusa being influenced by French and other photographers and an endless iteration of other influences. So one of the things that we were thinking about is how within the history of photography these kinds of collaboration then raise questions about authorship within photography. And what I wanted to do is just give you two examples from that project, and then I'll close my remarks. Because I think these questions are raised by the very first triptych that Brodsky sends to Esclusa. It's composed of 3 images, you can see here, each one becoming increasingly blurry. It's a building reflected in water, and as you move from left to right, the images become more blurry. They pay homage in some way to Esclusa's preferred mode of presentation, which is the photographic series. Esclusa very often practices by producing series of images. And so his first multiple image that he sends to Esclusa suggests a process of disappearance, a decline in the clarity of vision, and in doing so evokes several of Esclusa's own cherished motifs. The relations between water and dissolution, reflections and repetitions of all kinds, memory and forgetfulness, presence and absence, stillness and movement, light and darkness, and day and night. So the possibility of this photograph depends on what he had already learned from Esclusa. I mean, a lot of us are in this room are teachers, right? So what you have is you have somebody sending an image to somebody, but in a certain sense, because he's sending an image to someone who was his teacher, that image is actually partially coming from Manuel. So it becomes a way of thinking about correspondence in general. And one of the claims is that in a correspondence, when someone sits down to send a missive or a photograph to someone else, that missive or photograph actually comes from the destination, right, rather than simply from the one who is sending the letter. Now, Esclusa responds by sending this triptych. So you get again a series of images that move toward a disappearance. You have the snake, then the shedding of the skin, and then the trace of the snake later. So that you have the last image is the trace of the snake, the trace that is visible in the previous image. And like Brodsky's triptych, this one records the process of a disappearance. So the triptych implies a passage of time, a transformation and disappearance, a memory trace that indicates this loss, and then in doing that, meditates self-reflexively on the photographic medium. So I'm going to present one more, and this will be the last exchange. This is an image that Esclusa sends to Manuel. And Manuel, that Esclusa sends to Brodsky. Manuel Esclusa sends to Marcelo Brodsky. He sends this image of a footprint in sand, and again, you get the same disappearing process as you move from left to right. Esclusa sends this to Brodsky, and Brodsky responds by sending this. Right? So Esclusa sends a footprint in sand, and Brodsky replies with a hand in water. Okay. Now, at a certain point, Brodsky is giving a lecture. He shows people in the audience this exchange. And then in the discussion, somebody points out to him that there's actually a kind of hand in the upper part of the image. Right? So what Brodsky comes to understand is that at a certain point, he had seen the hand without seeing it, that he was responding to something unconsciously within the image. So what it suggests, among other things, is that first of all, they're responding to each other, but then they respond to things that they register without seeing fully. It looks like a footprint in sand, like a footprint in a beach. But it's actually an image that Manuel took in the Sahara Desert. He was doing a project on refugees. He takes this image, and this image is actually taken on the day that he receives a phone call telling him that his father has just died. So it's an image that bears the traces of a series of historical events that include the relationship between Esclusa and Brodsky, but also include histories that they both share and do not share. Okay? So one of the things that we were trying to do then in the project is offer an alternative history of photography by focusing on the transnational dimension of technological traffic and image production at a time when photography is, as Gabriela was saying, at the center of debates over representation, authorship, and reception in a global contemporary culture. The book seeks to be a kind of 21st century manual for reading photographs and photographic discourse, and its attention to the different modes of itinerancy that have characterized the history of photography enables a more compelling, active, transnational lens through which to understand not only the effects of the speed of globalization on contemporary techniques of vision, but also the various ways in which the itinerancies already in motion from the beginnings of photography have remained with us today, even if transformed into different and new forms. The focus on Ibero-American archives and exchanges also challenges the dominance of Europe and North American photographs and photography within traditional histories of photography, and asks us to rethink photography's beginnings and its many futures. So thank you very much for your listening to this, and I think we'll open it up now for discussion.
Thanks. It's fascinating. I'm intrigued by your argument about photography as itinerant. Yeah, but I'm just wondering, if you could say a little more about the singularity of photography, if there is a singularity, because the notion of itinerancy, it kind of reminds me of, what Derrida has already said about reading and going back to Plato and things. So, how do we draw that difference between writing and photography based on that notion of itinerancy?
The difference between writing and photography.
Yeah. Is there, based on this notion of, being itinerant.
Okay. Do you want to? Okay. One of the things that I'll say very quickly is when we began putting the project together, the former curator of photography told me that one of the things I would discover as I was putting this together, is how non-itinerant valuable works of art can be. And I think we did discover that. But one of the things that we were suggesting, and this is the reason I began with the Foucault quote, right, is that what he tries to suggest from the very beginning is that it's extremely difficult to specify what photography is, right? Photography, he suggests, is never a single thing. It already from the very beginning was attaching itself to, engaging, linked to other mediums, including engraving, lithography, painting, etc. So that one of the things we were in fact trying to engage are debates about medium specificity in general. Right? And one of the things that I would argue is that what makes photography, like what makes writing, is that neither photography nor writing are ever simply themselves. Right? I think that you could, so then that gives us a problem, right? So that it's like when somebody says, because people often say this, if everything is political, then nothing is political, right? I always think that everything is political, but that doesn't relieve you of the responsibility of differentiating between different politics. Right? So I would say everything is photographic, but that doesn't mean, it doesn't relieve you of the responsibility of differentiating the different ways in which things become photographic, right? One of the things that we did, for example, in terms of the itinerant languages of photography, right? We're not simply talking about the circulation of photographs, the itinerancy of photographers when they travel to other countries. We are talking about those things. But we're also interested in the itinerancy of the languages and discourses with which people talk about photography. So that if you read the history of photography, theories of photography, there are lots of terms that people use to talk about photography. One of the things that we wanted to do was show how those discourses themselves are itinerant, so that things that we wouldn't normally associate with photography can become understood as photographic. So if you were tracking some of the images that were circulating during Gabriela's presentation, you would see, for example, the image from Pompeii of the cast of a pregnant woman. That's a negative, right? Because that's a mold that was made from a body that had been buried in ashes. That's a negative, right? There are images of stars in that early part of the exhibition, the early part of the book. I've argued elsewhere that the history of photography could be said to begin in the interpretation of stars, right? You see a light, and that light could be linked to a dead star, so that the light is already a figure of the relationship between presence and absence, light and darkness, etc. Trees, images of trees. The tree, the light hits through the leaves, it casts its shadow on the ground, and the trees move, so it's a moving image. But the tree becomes a photographic apparatus. If trees, stars, and corpses can become figures for photography, then maybe we don't know what a photograph is, right? And I think that the link between photography and writing is absolutely strong, right? Because photography is a mode of inscription, as writing is. In the visual correspondences, I have this ongoing discussion with Marcelo because hey, come on, it's a visual correspondence, no language whatsoever, he wants to say. But not, beyond the fact that some of the correspondences include language in the images, you can't respond to the image you receive without minimally identifying what's in the image that you receive, right? So he has to say, oh, I see a footprint in sand in his head before he can send a hand in water. So I think that what we're trying to formalize and present is the difficulty that you're asking, right? Or it's the difficulty of the question you're asking. How do you specify the singularity of a medium when one of the things that makes that medium a medium is its relation to everything else? So I'll just say one more thing and then that's it. People who know me in the room know that I always threaten to go on forever like a river. But it's a way to formalize a structure, right? So here's what it is, right? Photography is what it is precisely because of its relation and difference to all these different mediums. But then precisely because of its relation to these other mediums, it's never simply itself, unless it says, I, photography, am a medium that is never simply itself. Yes?
Thank you very much. I highly enjoyed the presentation. I'm looking forward to visit the exhibit at the museum. Something that struck me as you were providing sort of your interpretation of photography and the evolution of photography, both as image and technique, is that while you are stressing the itinerant aspect of image, the images, the selection of images presented here are highly, strongly anchored in historical and political national narratives.
Absolutely.
It's very clear to see the Mexican photos and the Mexican Revolution and Mexican people, the Argentine photos with the Argentine disappearances and that particular period of our history, the Spanish photos and the toreros. The aesthetics of either Buenos Aires or Barcelona in the 60s or 70s. So it's very clear for who is seeing to place these images. So perhaps, well, I mean, there is no doubt that the images are moving and they're itinerant and they're being interpreted all the time. Perhaps what amazed me is how political or how historical narratives can be easily identified in just a more or less random selection of photos. So could you talk a little more about that, sort of the way in which these photographs, are inscribed in relevant historical and political narratives or events?
And what's excluded from these collections, perhaps, as a supplement?
Right.
From our selection or from
No,
each
not
of the
yours,
collections?
not yours, but the various ones that you alluded to, the national collection.
Right.
Sure.
I think our goal was to do both things at the same time, as I explained in my general presentation. The first section is focused on Brazil, the second section is focused on Mexico, but it also has American and European photographers who traveled to Mexico and met other photographers in the city of Mexico in particular. The third one has a mix of different photographers for different countries, and the last one is mostly focused on contemporary Argentine photographers, but actually there is only one picture that refers to the disappear The other ones don't have anything to do with the disappear. It has to do with other debates around photography. But I'll give you an example with the collection of the Emperor of Brazil, Don Pedro II in this case. One of the aspects we wanted to emphasize by choosing this particular portrait is that how the genre of the portrait is modified by being used by the emperor. It's a studio portrait but with tropical plants. Is when the emperor is trying to change his public image. The emperor is Portuguese, the Portuguese family, Portuguese, European, and Brazilian. Some of the pictures, like this one, this is by Amodio. The collection, the emperor's collection, had pictures from all over the world. He had agents in Africa and in Europe and United States who were buying photographs for him, and these photographs were taken not by Brazilian photographers, even though they are part of the Brazilian collection. So one of the aspects that we want to emphasize with this particular case is how these particular prints travel from other parts of the globe to Brazil. The same in the case of or something similar with the Mexican case. As you know, the Mexican Revolution was the first revolution that was totally photographed. The photographers were Mexican, but they were also American, they were also European. Some of these postcards circulated mostly in the southern part of the United States as postcards. Americans were buying these images of the revolution as postcards. We don't know exactly why, but they were. And I'm talking about thousands of photographs circulated across the border and to Europe. Most of these photographs, another interesting aspect from the material history, from the point of view of the material history of photography, is that most of these photographs never circulated as they are shown in the gallery. They were printed in newspapers or magazines, or they circulated, as I already said, as postcards. There is a new transformation when we choose these images, and the museum decides that they are going to print in this size with that frame, in this particular order on that particular wall. I don't know if you can mention some other example.
I have a lot to say, but I'll focus on one particular thing, because I think that what you're asking about has everything to do with how you read an image historically, right? So you look at an image, and I think you have to do two things simultaneously to read an image historically. On the one hand, you have to do exactly what you say, which is to say you have to reconstruct the circumstances and context within which that particular image was produced. But at the same time, you simultaneously have to pay attention to the force of decontextualization that takes place within every single photograph that's taken. So in order to read an image historically, you have to simultaneously contextualize and decontextualize. And I think that's the most difficult thing, because, for example, that's why I wanted to end with, it's one of the things that one could draw from the ending discussion of the correspondence with Esclusa and Brodsky, right? Brodsky is Argentine, Esclusa is Catalonian, but Brodsky goes and studies with Esclusa. So are his eyes Argentinian eyes after that encounter? Can you only locate how he sees as Argentinian? And I think you can't. Right? So if you look at the sections are loosely linked to the 4 sites that we were collaborating with, these 4 countries. But even as Gabriela was suggesting, even the Brazil room already incorporates materials from all over the globe, because the emperor was collecting things from all over the globe, and he himself was not Brazilian only. Right? The other thing I'll say in a more formal way is that this link between singularity and repetition is an entirely photographic couple. Right? Every photograph asks you to think about the relationship between singularity and repetition, or singularity and reproduction. And I would even say that couple is another name for photography, or vice versa.
I can give you another example here from the Mexican section. This is by Paul Strand, the American photographer. He was hired by the Mexican revolutionary government to take pictures of Mexican culture or Mexican communities. He used a different kind of camera, so the people didn't know that he was taking a picture.
A false lens. So
a false lens on the side, etc., etc. But then you have this picture by Alvarez Bravo, who is a contemporary of Paul Strand. Within the similar genre, these are pictures of quote-unquote Mexican popular characters or subjects. But the attitude of this picture implicitly is questioning the transparency that Paul Strand's photograph suggests. He has his arms crossed, he's looking away. His attitude is apparently one of resistance towards the photographer. And this goes even further when we look at this picture by Graciela Iturbide, who is a disciple of Alvarez Bravo. Is again the same genre, but in this case, you don't even know who the subject is. He has a dress and pants. He has an indigenous mask, but under the indigenous mask, you have a wrestling mask. You don't know whether it's a kid, or it's a teenager, or it's a short, I don't know, elderly person. So even though Graciela didn't say anything about this picture, it's obvious, to us at least, after doing some research, that they are dialoguing with each other. So it's the same genre that is moving from one photographer to the next. They are having a dialogue, but it's also an argument between themselves and what Mexican culture is.
Whether or not you can access it. Right, because Strand is presumably hiding the fact that he's taking the image so that he can have a more natural, transparent image, so he can capture them as they really are. And then you have the other one which is resisting, and then the other one, take off the mask and there's still another mask. So it increasingly suggests that you don't have access to the portrait. Does that make so? And you see there's a mix there where the Mexican photographers are incorporating something from Strand. Strand also goes there with his own. I mean, that's what it is, right? How do you see something? Mm-hmm. And what we're suggesting is that when you look at something, the only reason you can see something is because your perception is full of memories, mm-hmm. right? And those memories belong and don't belong to you at the same time.
Yeah. A question: if you would want to discuss the relationship of aesthetics of photojournalists who have the ability to see an event, but it ends up being a work of art. An example I throw out within this culture is Sebastião Salgado.
Yeah. But we have several, well, I think many pictures that illustrate that phenomenon. Some of them, let's go to Marcelo Brodsky's picture of his brother, Nando. This one is a good example. It has to do also with the one particular type of photograph we're interested in, that is a photograph of a photograph or an image of an image, and different uses of the archive. The picture was taken by Marcelo Brodsky, an Argentinian photographer who was in exile during the military dictatorship after 1976. This is a picture of his brother. It was taken by a prisoner in a detention camp during the dictatorship after he was tortured. The prisoner who took the picture have been forced to take pictures of the people in this camp, but he was lucky and he was released, and he took with him 6 or 7 negatives. He hid them in his body, and this is one of them. So this was printed and then it was used during the trial to prove that Fernando Brodsky, the guy in the picture, had been in that detention camp. Now this particular, you can see here the history, or the implicit history of this particular image, the image of Nando that was taken in that detention camp, and then the history of the image that Marcelo Brodsky produced of the image. The hand that appears in the photograph is the hand of the person who was able to save the negative, the ex-prisoner. And now this picture is here at an art museum. So you can also see that how this quote-unquote the same image is changing its meaning according to the context in which it is located. So that would be one of the examples, but there are many others.
I mean, the other thing I would say is it's linked to the earlier question about how you read an image historically, because you can start reconstructing the context, right? It looks like an image, but it's actually an archive. It's an image that bears the traces of several histories, right? And at the same time, because like every photograph, it has ripped something out of a context, it can become a self-reflexive meditation on every photograph. Right? This photograph tells you what's true of every photograph. Every photograph hands you an image. Right? And you cannot say that enough. People think that when they have a photograph in their hand, that they have what the photograph is of. No, you have an image of what was photographed. Right? So it tells you that every photograph is about handing something down, handing something over. It's about transmission, legacy, etc. And all of the things are there precisely because this is a picture of his brother who's been lost. Right? So it's also linked to an act of mourning, and every photograph is linked to mourning. And that's something that has been said from the beginning of theories of photography, because when you have a photograph in your hand, it's the best evidence that what you have in your hand is not what was photographed. So the photograph exists structurally in relation to the absence of what was photographed. So it's a photograph of a photograph, and in that way is a photograph about photography as well as a photograph that is linked to all these particular historical events.
Yeah, even in this particular case where the archive is not obvious, this is an archive of some buildings that were designed in the 40s and 50s and were built in the Buenos Aires province in a small camps. And Pastorino Diaz, the photographer, put together an archive of these buildings. He took the pictures at night. But this is also a quotation because the print is a gun print that is not used anymore. It's a 19th century technology. And he works with obsolete technologies. So even though you cannot tell, okay, why is this a quotation? What does it have to do with with an archival gesture of quoting something that is photography? What he's quoting is in the material itself. Is in this particular print that is a gun print and is not used anymore. There is another example. Let me see. This one by Bruno Dumner, also an Argentinian photographer. This is a photogram. Photographs is a technology that was used mostly in the late 19th century, but also by the avant-garde, Man Ray, and other photographers used that. So even though the quotations is not explicit, and it doesn't have to do with the representation. Actually, it's a comment on representation in photography. It's not about representation. It's about the trace of light. And there is a quotation about of a technology that is not used anymore.
He walked into a dark room with a piece of contact paper on his hand and just started looking for light. And this is what gets produced. So it's about the relationship between paper, light, the body, etc., and other things. But it is citing an earlier technology.
I'll wait.
No, well, first of all, congratulations. This is an amazing exhibition. And I have 3 questions. The first one is, did you plan this show to be itinerant? Because what is going to happen with the show after, And the second one, did you produce?
We thought about that too late.
Yeah.
That's the quick
Too
answer.
late. Did this show produce a new archive? I mean, because I know that the museum purchased like some photographs, no? So if you can say something about that. And Gabriela mentioned like an exploration between literature and photography during the symposium you had. How did you translate or not this exploration into this exhibition?
Yeah, okay. The first one was easy. We thought about moving it too late, really. And it seems that you have to, not knowing, that you have to start like 2 years, 3 years in advance doing this. We started too late. Other museums were interested, but they couldn't take the exhibition until the spring of 2015. And there was no way to store and then reconstruct the exhibition in another place. The second question
About the archive.
Oh, yes. We were able to encourage the museum, and it very graciously did this. I mean, to use the exhibition as an occasion to build its Latin American photo collection, which is not the strongest element of its photo collection. So they purchased 17 of the prints that are in the exhibition. So we're very happy with that. And then in terms of literature, Gabriela already singled this one out. This is by PIIRS, an Argentinian photographer. And this is one of 27 prints that he did in relation to Borges' story, The Aleph. So this is the Aleph, the sphere that includes everything within it, which is a very photographic story, actually. But he has 27 prints that all, in one way or another, take images of sites in Buenos Aires that were linked to Borges. And the ball is also the ball on the gaucho's thing where he throws it around, and it's picking up, capturing these 27 sites in Buenos Aires. So it is a translation of a literary story into a photograph. It's like Jeff Wall staging a scene from Ellison's The Invisible Man. Right? So there are lots of ways in which, many instances in which photography incorporates other mediums and vice versa. And that was one of the three topoi that we were trying to think about in terms of
This one has a twist too, because the sphere in Borges' story is the one that allows you to see everything. And in this case, it's the blind spot. Picture. It's the one that doesn't allow you to see. And the connection between blindness and vision, which is also part of what Eduardo likes to call the languages of photography.
It's been about 150 years, say, from the first photograph in the exhibition until today. Do you see changes in the way photographers, use subjects, or is it more the different technologies that are available today that will differentiate the earlier works to works that are being created today?
It's a good question. It's a difficult question, an easy question. It depends on how we approach it. Technology has introduced many changes in the uses and the production and exchange of images, but our main assumption is that even though you can see those technological changes, there is something that doesn't change in terms of photography, and to some extent that is proven by some of the images and some of the photographs we have included in the exhibition, like the ones I show in which the current photographers are quoting technologies from the 19th century. So photography is continue using some of those technologies that are not completely obsolete.
I mean, I'm a strange bird in this context, right? Because if I can start talking about trees and corpses and stars and photographic, I have a very wide idea of what can be photographic, right? So in a certain sense, what my interest is in, of course I'm interested in photography as a set of technologies, as a history of practices, as something that comes with a series of different languages with which people talk about photography. And I think that you can track, as you say, different technologies through the history of photography. But one of the things that we're trying to say is that from the very beginning, as the quote from Foucault suggests, that already there were several different technologies at work, even in the production of the very first photograph. Right? So one of the things that I've always been interested in is thinking about the way in which the questions that one can talk about in relation to photography, its relation to questions of death, mourning, absence, light and darkness, memory and forgetfulness, all the different ways in which people talk about what a photograph can offer you. I think that these things, these questions, these philosophical questions don't change. What you have is maybe an intensification of practices that make those questions more visible in some way. But I think that those questions don't change for me. So that when people talk about the death of photography with the advent of digitization, that's why the Rennó image is so great, because you have this analog camera taking a picture of a digital camera as if the digital was before the analog. And I think when people talk about the death of photography, for me, photography has always been associated with death from the very beginning, for the reason that I suggested, that you have a photograph and you don't have the photographed. So it's related to this absence of what was photographed. So if you really wanted to talk about the death of photography, you would have to talk about the death of photography, in which case you would be talking about photography's survival. And so I think photography has always been about both death and survival, and that has stayed the same despite all the different forms, all the different changes that have happened within the technology.
Gabriela Meiselas, Eduardo Cadava. Thank you very much.